The carriage stopped hard, throwing Charlotte forward against the door. Outside, rain beat down on the gravel path of Bramwell Hall, and thunder rolled across the dark sky like a warning. She pressed her gloved hand against her chest, trying to slow her breathing before the footman opened the door. Tonight was her wedding night, and she did not know the man she had just promised her whole life to. Duke Alexander Hartwell stood at the top of the stone steps, his tall figure lit by a single lantern. He did not smile. He did not move to help her from the carriage. He simply watched, his face unreadable, as if she were a delivery he had been expecting rather than a bride he had just married. Charlotte lifted the hem of her wedding dress and stepped down into the rain herself. No one offered a hand. The wind pulled at her veil, and for a moment she thought it might tear away completely and vanish into the storm, the way she feared her old life already had. "You are late," Alexander said when she reached the top step. His voice was calm, almost bored, as though her arrival were a minor inconvenience rather than the beginning of a marriage. "The roads were flooded, Your Grace," she answered quietly. He studied her for a moment, his eyes moving over her face without warmth, without curiosity. Then he turned and walked into the house, leaving her to follow on her own. A young maid rushed forward with an umbrella, far too late to be of any real use, and guided Charlotte inside. The great hall of Bramwell was cold, despite the fires burning in the hearths. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. Servants stood in 2 straight lines, bowing as she passed, but none of them met her gaze. She felt like a stranger walking through a house that had already decided it did not want her. That night Alexander did not come to her chamber. She sat by the window in her nightgown, listening to the storm outside, waiting for footsteps that never came. At some point near dawn, exhaustion won over hope, and she fell asleep in the chair, her wedding dress still hanging on its hook, untouched. She woke to the sound of a maid quietly building the fire. The girl, whose name Charlotte would later learn was Nora, glanced at her with something like pity before quickly looking away. "Good morning, Your Grace," Nora whispered. Charlotte straightened in the chair, trying to gather what dignity she could. "Good morning. Has the Duke already left for the day?" "He rides out early, Your Grace, every morning. He does not usually return until supper." It was the first of many mornings that would follow the same pattern. Charlotte quickly learned that her husband's world ran on a schedule that did not include her. He rose before the sun, disappeared into the fields or his study, and reappeared only when the household bell called everyone to the dining room. Even then, his attention rarely lifted from his letters and ledgers. She had known, of course, that this marriage was not born of love. Her family's estate had fallen into debt after her father's failed investments, and the Hartwell family had once owed the Winslows a favor from many years before. A marriage between the 2 houses settled both matters at once, her father's debt forgiven, the old favor repaid, and 2 strangers bound together for the rest of their lives. Charlotte had told herself, on the long carriage ride to Bramwell, that many marriages began this way and grew into something warmer with time. She had heard stories of couples who barely spoke a word to each other on their wedding day, and later became devoted partners. She held onto that hope the way a traveler holds onto a candle in the dark, small and flickering, but enough to keep walking forward. The first weeks tested that hope again and again. At dinner, Alexander spoke to his steward about crops and taxes, to his cousin about horses, to anyone at all except her. When Charlotte tried to ask about his day, his answers came short and final, closing the conversation before it could begin. "How was your ride today, Your Grace?" she asked one evening, folding her napkin carefully in her lap. "Uneventful," he said, not looking up from his plate. "The gardener mentioned the western fields are struggling with drainage. I wondered if—" "My steward handles such matters." His tone was not unkind, but it carried a wall she could not seem to climb over, no matter how gently she tried. She stopped trying to speak of estate matters after that, though she continued to notice things. She noticed the tenant cottages with roofs in need of repair, the kitchen accounts that did not quite balance, the older servants who had not received proper wages in months, because no one had thought to review the ledgers carefully. Rather than raise these matters at dinner, where they were so clearly unwelcome, Charlotte began to quietly involve herself in the running of the household. Mrs. Dorsey, the housekeeper, was the first to notice. She was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a soft heart hidden beneath years of strict discipline. At first, she watched the new Duchess with suspicion, expecting the pampered daughter of a struggling family to demand luxuries the estate could not afford. Instead, she found Charlotte in the linen room one afternoon, counting sheets and making notes in a small book. "Your Grace, you needn't trouble yourself with such things," Mrs. Dorsey said, startled. "I like to understand how a household runs," Charlotte replied with a small smile, "and I think we may be able to save a good deal if we reorganize the storage here. Half of these linens have been folded wrong for years and are wearing thin at the same creases." Mrs. Dorsey blinked, unsure whether to be offended or impressed. She chose, in the end, to be impressed, and from that day the two women formed a quiet partnership that neither of them announced to the rest of the house. Word of the Duchess's competence spread slowly among the staff, the way water spreads beneath a locked door, unseen, but steady. The cook found that Charlotte had a gift for stretching a modest budget into generous meals without waste. The stable master discovered she knew more about horses than he expected, having grown up on a smaller estate where she had helped care for the animals herself. The tenant families began to speak of a kind lady at the hall who listened to their troubles and quietly ensured repairs were made, even when she had to pay for small things from her own personal allowance rather than trouble her husband with the expense. Yet none of this reached Alexander's notice, or if it did, he never spoke of it. He passed through his own home like a guest who had grown tired of the visit but had nowhere else to go. Charlotte began to understand, slowly and painfully, that his coldness was not simply a matter of duty over affection. There was a wound in him somewhere, old and unhealed, though she did not yet know its shape. One evening, several weeks into their marriage, she found him standing alone in the portrait gallery, staring at a painting Charlotte had not noticed before, a young woman with golden hair and a soft, laughing expression, her eyes bright with a joy that seemed to belong to a different world than the quiet, careful one Charlotte now lived in. "Who is she?" Charlotte asked gently, stepping into the gallery. Alexander's shoulders stiffened at the sound of her voice, as though he had been caught somewhere he should not have been. "No one of importance," he said, and walked past her without another word. Charlotte stood alone before the painting for a long moment, studying the woman's face, memorizing the shape of her smile. She did not know her name yet, but she understood, with the quiet certainty of someone piecing together a puzzle from its edges, that this woman was not no one. Whoever she was, she occupied a space in Alexander's heart that Charlotte had not yet been given even the smallest room to enter. That night she wrote in the small journal she had begun keeping since her arrival at Bramwell. She wrote of the rain on her wedding night, of the empty chair by the fire, of Mrs. Dorsey's gruff kindness and the tenant children who had begun to wave at her carriage. And she wrote, in careful, steady handwriting, about the woman in the painting. "I do not know her name," she wrote, "but I know her shadow falls across this house and across my husband's heart, though he has never spoken a word about her to me. I am beginning to understand that I have married not just a man, but a grief he has not yet allowed himself to feel. I do not know if I have the patience for this. I do not know if patience is even what is required. But I have made a vow, and I intend to keep it, whatever it costs me." She closed the journal and set it in the drawer of her writing desk, beside a small collection of pressed flowers she had gathered from the garden that morning. The only company, she thought wryly, that seemed to welcome her without hesitation at Bramwell Hall. Outside her window, the storm from her wedding night had long since passed, leaving behind clear skies and a cold, silver moon. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the faint sound of Alexander's study door closing, followed by silence. She wondered, as she blew out her candle, how many more nights she would spend listening for footsteps that did not come, and how long a person could wait for warmth before the waiting itself became a kind of quiet, private sorrow. She did not yet know that this same question would follow her for years to come, growing heavier with each season that passed, each dinner spent in polite silence, Each small kindness she offered that went unnoticed by the one person whose notice she wanted most. She only knew, that first night, that she had chosen to stay, and that choosing to stay would require a strength she was only beginning to discover within herself. The candle went dark, and Bramwell Hall settled into stillness, its walls holding the quiet beginning of a story that neither Charlotte nor Alexander could yet see the shape of, a story that would take years to unfold, and would end in a way neither of them expected on that cold, rain-soaked night, when a carriage first stopped before the great stone steps. 3 years passed at Bramwell Hall, and the rhythm of Charlotte's life had settled into something she no longer questioned aloud, though it still ached quietly beneath the surface of every ordinary day. She rose early, before the household fully woke, and walked the gardens while the dew still clung to the grass. It was the only hour that belonged entirely to her, before the demands of the house and the silence of her marriage pressed in again. By now she managed nearly every aspect of Bramwell's daily operations, though few outside the household staff knew the true extent of her involvement. The accounts, once careless and full of small losses, ran clean and steady under her careful eye. The tenant cottages, once neglected, had new roofs and repaired fences, paid for through a combination of estate funds she had reorganized and her own personal allowance, spent so quietly that even Mrs. Dorsey sometimes did not learn of a repair until after it was finished. "You spoil them," Mrs. Dorsey said one afternoon, watching Charlotte hand a basket of bread and preserves to a tenant's young son at the kitchen door. "I do not spoil them," Charlotte replied, smiling as the boy ran off toward the fields. "I simply remember that kindness costs little and means a great deal." Mrs. Dorsey shook her head, though there was no real disapproval in it. Over the years, the older woman had become something close to a friend, one of the few people at Bramwell who understood the quiet loneliness Charlotte carried beneath her composed exterior. She never asked Charlotte directly about her marriage, but she noticed things, the way Charlotte's eyes lingered a moment too long on an empty chair at the breakfast table, the way she straightened at the sound of footsteps in the hall, only to soften with quiet disappointment when they were not the ones she hoped for. Alexander remained largely unchanged by the passing years, at least on the surface. He managed the estate's larger affairs with steady competence, rode out each morning, and attended to his correspondence with the same rigid discipline he had shown since Charlotte's first weeks in the house. He was not unkind to her, not in any way she could name or complain of. He simply did not see her, in the way a person might walk past a familiar piece of furniture every day without truly looking at it. Dinner remained their most consistent point of contact, though even this had become a kind of ritual performance rather than a genuine exchange. Charlotte would ask after his day. He would answer briefly. She would mention some small matter of the household, a repair completed, a tenant's new child, a letter from her sister in the countryside, and he would nod or make a polite sound of acknowledgement, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Your sister writes often," he said one evening, the closest thing to genuine curiosity he had shown in weeks. "She does," Charlotte said, brightening slightly. "She has a new daughter now. She wishes I would visit, but the harvest season keeps me occupied here." "You could go," Alexander said. "I would not object." Charlotte studied his face for a moment, searching for some hint of what lay beneath the simple statement, whether it was genuine care for her happiness or simply relief at the thought of an empty house. She could not tell. That uncertainty, more than any cruelty he might have shown her, was perhaps the hardest part of her marriage to bear. "Perhaps in the spring," she said finally, and the conversation moved on to other things. It was around this time that Charlotte began to notice a change in Alexander's demeanor, subtle at first, like the first cool breath of autumn before the leaves have truly begun to turn. He seemed distracted in a new way, his attention pulled toward something beyond the estate's usual concerns. He received more letters than before, some of which he read quickly and folded away into his coat before anyone else could glimpse the handwriting. He began attending more social functions in the nearby town of Ashcombe, functions he had previously dismissed as tiresome obligations. Charlotte did not ask him directly what had changed. She had learned over 3 years of marriage that direct questions rarely earned honest answers from her husband, only the same polished deflections he offered anyone who ventured too close to the private rooms of his heart. Instead, she watched, and she waited, and she continued the quiet work of running Bramwell Hall with the same steady dedication she had shown since her first days there. It was Nora, the young maid who had grown from a nervous girl into a capable and trusted member of the household, who first mentioned the name that would soon change everything. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," Nora said one morning, helping Charlotte arrange her hair before breakfast, "but there is talk in the town about Lady Grant returning to Ashcombe. They say her husband passed some months ago, and she has come back to stay with her aunt." Charlotte's hands stilled for a moment on the ribbon she had been tying. "Lady Grant," she repeated softly. "Yes, Your Grace. Isabel Grant. They say she was very close with the Duke before his marriage in his younger years." Before, Nora stopped herself, suddenly aware she had perhaps said too much, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Before what, Nora?" Charlotte asked gently, though her heart had begun to beat a little faster. "I only meant, Your Grace, before he became the Duke, when he was still Lord Hartwell and his father was alive. Some of the older staff remember them together often. I did not mean to speak out of turn." Charlotte reassured the girl that no offense had been taken, though privately, the pieces of a puzzle she had carried since her first weeks at Bramwell began to shift and settle into a clearer shape. The woman in the portrait. The name Alexander had refused to speak. The wound she had sensed in him from the very beginning, old and carefully guarded. She did not confront him. She had never been the kind of woman who demanded answers through anger or accusation, believing instead that truth revealed itself in its own time, if given patience and space to breathe. But she found herself, in the weeks that followed, paying closer attention to the letters that arrived for him, to the days he chose to ride into Ashcombe rather than tend to the estate's business, to the faint change in his posture whenever a particular name was mentioned at dinner by a visiting neighbor. Autumn deepened into winter, and the first snow fell over Bramwell's fields just as the annual harvest ball approached, a tradition the Hartwell family had kept for generations, bringing together the local gentry and tenant families alike for an evening of music and celebration. Charlotte had always enjoyed the preparations for the ball, finding joy in choosing the decorations, planning the menu with the cook, and watching the great hall transform from its usual quiet grandeur into something warm and alive with candlelight and laughter. This year, however, she found herself approaching the preparations with a quiet unease she could not fully explain, though she suspected, deep down, that the unease had a name, and that name belonged to a woman with golden hair whose portrait had once hung, unexplained, in the gallery of Bramwell Hall. On the evening of the ball, Charlotte dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue silk, one that Mrs. Dorsey had helped her choose specifically, because it complemented her dark hair and brought out the warmth in her eyes. She wanted, for reasons she did not fully examine, to look her best that night, though she could not have said exactly what she hoped to achieve by it. The great hall glowed with candlelight when she descended the staircase, the sound of music and conversation rising to greet her. She found Alexander near the entrance, speaking with a small group of neighboring landowners, his posture relaxed in a way she rarely saw at home. For a moment, watching him from across the room, she allowed herself to remember why she had once hoped, however faintly, that this marriage might grow into something warmer than duty. Then the doors opened again, and a woman entered whose golden hair caught the candlelight exactly as it had in the painting Charlotte had studied so many times in the quiet hours of the gallery. Lady Isabel Grant moved through the crowd with an easy grace, greeting old acquaintances with warm familiarity. And when her eyes finally found Alexander across the room, something passed between them that Charlotte recognized immediately, though she wished, with a sudden and aching intensity, that she did not. It was not a look of scandal or impropriety. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more painful to witness. The unmistakable look of two people who had once loved each other deeply, and who had never quite finished the conversation that love demanded. Charlotte stood at the edge of the hall, her hands folded carefully in front of her deep blue gown, and watched her husband's face soften in a way it had never once softened for her in 3 years of marriage. She did not cry. She did not allow her expression to change in any way that might draw the attention of the other guests. She simply stood and watched and understood with a clarity that settled into her chest like a stone, that whatever role she had been given in Alexander Hartwell's life, it was not the role of a woman he loved. In the days that followed the ball, Charlotte noticed a subtle shift in the way the household staff regarded her, a kind of careful gentleness that had not been present before, as though word of what had passed at the ball, unspoken though it was, had somehow traveled through the halls of Bramwell faster than she could have anticipated. Mrs. Dorsey began appearing at odd hours with small offerings, a fresh pot of tea, an extra blanket for the evening chill, a quiet word of encouragement about the schoolhouse plans Charlotte had begun sketching in her spare hours. None of it was ever spoken aloud directly, but Charlotte understood the gesture for what it was, a form of loyalty that required no explanation. She threw herself further into her work at Bramwell during those weeks, finding a strange comfort in the physical labor of organizing linens, reviewing tenant leases, and walking the fields with the estate steward to discuss drainage improvements for the coming spring. It was easier, she found, to measure her worth in these tangible accomplishments than to dwell on the ache that had settled in her chest since the harvest ball. She began keeping longer hours at her desk, drafting letters to charitable societies in London that might help fund a proper schoolhouse for the tenant children, an idea that had been forming quietly in her mind for months, but which now, in the aftermath of watching Alexander's face soften for another woman, felt more urgent than ever, a purpose entirely her own that no one could take from her. Nora, sensing the Duchess's quiet sorrow though she never spoke of it directly, began leaving small kindnesses of her own, a favorite flower placed in a vase by the window, a book of poetry borrowed from the estate library and left open to a particularly comforting passage. Charlotte noticed these small gestures and was moved by them more deeply than she let on, understanding that even in a house where her husband's heart remained closed to her, she had nonetheless built a circle of genuine affection among those who served alongside her. Later that night, long after the guests had departed and the candles had burned low, Charlotte sat once again at her writing desk, her journal open before her. She dipped her pen and wrote slowly, her handwriting steady despite the storm of feeling beneath it. "I saw her tonight," she wrote. "Lady Isabel Grant, the woman from the painting, the woman whose name he could never bring himself to speak. I understand now why the gallery held her portrait, and why he walked away so quickly when I asked. I do not blame him for loving her once. I do not even blame him for loving her still, though it grieves me more than I have words to express. What I find harder to accept is my own foolishness in hoping, quietly and persistently, for 3 long years, that patience alone might be enough to earn a place in a heart that was never truly available to be won." She paused, the pen hovering above the page, before adding one final line, the ink slightly darker where she had pressed too hard in a moment of quiet resolve. "I will not stop being kind. I will not stop tending this house, or these people, or the small, stubborn hope I still carry that things might change. But I will also stop waiting for him to notice me the way I once hoped he might. Some doors, I am beginning to understand, are not meant to be opened by patience alone." She closed the journal, extinguished her candle, and lay awake long into the night, listening to the quiet creak of Bramwell Hall settling around her, wondering how many more winters she would spend within these walls, waiting for a warmth that seemed to belong, entirely and irrevocably, to someone else. Spring came slowly to Bramwell that year, as though the season itself was reluctant to disturb the quiet sadness that had settled over the estate since the harvest ball. Charlotte continued her daily routines with the same steady discipline she had always shown, but those who knew her well, Mrs. Dorsey, Nora, and a handful of loyal tenants, noticed a certain stillness in her that had not been there before, a quiet resignation that seemed to sit just beneath her usual warmth. Alexander's visits to Ashcombe grew more frequent as the weeks passed. He rarely mentioned where he had been or whom he had seen, but Charlotte no longer needed to ask. The pattern was clear enough on its own. A letter would arrive in the Morning Post, its handwriting elegant and familiar, and by afternoon Alexander would be calling for his horse, dressed with more care than his usual estate business required. She never spoke of it to him directly. Instead, she poured her attention more fully into the running of Bramwell, as though sheer industry might fill the growing quiet inside her. She expanded the kitchen garden, arranged for a small school to be built for the tenant children, and began teaching some of the younger housemaids to read in the evening hours, using books from the estate's neglected library. "You could ask him for anything, you know," Mrs. Dorsey said one evening, watching Charlotte review the plans for the new schoolhouse by candlelight. "You are the Duchess. The tenants love you more than they ever loved his own mother, God rest her. You have earned the right to ask for support, for recognition, for something." Charlotte set down her pen and looked at the older woman with a tired but genuine smile. "I do not do this work for recognition, Mrs. Dorsey. I do it because it needs doing, and because it gives me purpose on the days when purpose is hard to find elsewhere." "That is not the same as saying you would not welcome a kind word from him now and then," Mrs. Dorsey said gently. Charlotte did not answer directly, but the quiet flicker in her eyes told the housekeeper everything the Duchess would not allow herself to say aloud. Charlotte found unexpected solace in her correspondence with her younger sister, Margaret, who lived several counties away with her own growing family. Margaret's letters arrived weekly, filled with the small, warm chaos of a household bursting with children's laughter and a husband who, by every account, adored his wife openly and without reservation. Charlotte read these letters slowly, savoring each detail even as a quiet, private ache accompanied the pleasure of hearing about her sister's happiness. "You must come visit soon," Margaret wrote in one such letter. "The children ask after their aunt constantly, and I confess I worry for you, tucked away in that grand house with a husband who, from everything you have told me, seems to spend more time with his ledgers than with you. Surely a woman as capable and kind as yourself deserves more warmth than that." Charlotte wrote back with careful reassurances, unwilling to burden her sister with the fuller truth of her loneliness, though she suspected Margaret read between the lines of her careful, composed letters more astutely than Charlotte gave her credit for. She promised to visit when the schoolhouse construction allowed her the time away, a promise she fully intended to keep, though circumstances would soon conspire to make such a visit far more difficult than either sister could have anticipated. It was during this season that Isabel Grant began appearing more openly in Alexander's life, no longer confined to letters and secretive rides into town. She began attending church services in the village near Bramwell, always seated where Alexander could not help but notice her. She accepted invitations to the homes of mutual friends, where Alexander was also expected, and though nothing scandalous ever occurred in full view of society, the whispers among the local gentry grew louder with each passing month. Charlotte heard the whispers too, though no one dared repeat them directly to her face. She caught fragments in the marketplace, in the careful silences that fell over conversations when she entered a room unexpectedly, in the pitying glances of women who had once been her friends and now seemed unsure how to look at her at all. One afternoon in early summer, she encountered Isabel Grant directly for the first time since the Harvest Ball, at a charity gathering organized by the local church to raise funds for the new schoolhouse Charlotte had championed. Isabel approached her with practiced grace, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that caught the sunlight streaming through the church hall's tall windows. "Your Grace," Isabel said, offering a polite curtsy, "I have heard a great deal about your work for the tenant children. It is truly admirable." "Thank you, Lady Grant," Charlotte replied, matching the other woman's composed civility with her own. "The children deserve every opportunity we can provide them." There was a pause between them, brief but charged, as though both women understood there was something else entirely they might have said, had propriety and pride not stood so firmly in the way. "Alexander speaks of you sometimes," Isabel said finally, her voice softer, almost hesitant. "He says you have transformed Bramwell in ways his own mother never managed." Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest at the casual use of her husband's first name, spoken with the easy familiarity of someone who had known him long before Charlotte herself had ever set foot in Bramwell Hall. "That is kind of him to say," she managed, keeping her voice level. "Though I suspect he speaks of many things I am not privy to." Isabel's expression flickered, something like guilt passing briefly across her features before she composed herself again. "Your Grace, I want you to know that I have never intended any disrespect toward you or your marriage. Alexander and I share a history, it is true, but that history belongs to the past." Charlotte studied the other woman's face for a long moment, searching for insincerity and finding, to her quiet surprise, what appeared to be genuine discomfort rather than triumph. "I believe you mean that, Lady Grant," she said finally. "But I think perhaps the past has a way of reaching into the present when we least expect it, regardless of our intentions." She excused herself soon after, unwilling to continue a conversation that offered her no real comfort, only a clearer confirmation of what she had already understood in her heart. As she walked back toward her carriage, she passed a small group of village women who fell silent at her approach, their expressions caught somewhere between sympathy and awkward embarrassment. That evening, Charlotte requested a private audience with Alexander in his study, the first time in nearly a year she had sought him out directly rather than waiting for their scheduled meals together. He looked up from his papers with mild surprise as she entered, closing the door softly behind her. "Charlotte," he said, using her given name, which he did so rarely that it startled her slightly, "is something wrong?" She sat in the chair across from his desk, folding her hands carefully in her lap, and chose her words with the same deliberate care she brought to every difficult task at Bramwell. "I saw Lady Grant today at the charity gathering for the schoolhouse. She spoke of you with a familiarity that suggests your friendship has continued more actively than I had realized." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might deny it entirely, might offer some polished excuse the way he had learned to deflect every uncomfortable question in the years of their marriage. Instead, he set down his pen and looked at her directly, something rare and unguarded passing briefly across his features. "Isabel and I were engaged once," he said quietly, "before my father's illness, before the debts, before any of this." He gestured vaguely at the room around them, at the weight of the estate and title he carried. "Her family withdrew their support when it became clear our finances would not recover quickly enough to satisfy their expectations. She married elsewhere. I did what was required of me and married you." Charlotte absorbed this information slowly, feeling something she had suspected for years finally settle into solid, undeniable shape. "And now that she has returned, unmarried and available, you find yourself drawn back to what might have been." "It is not so simple," Alexander said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the statement entirely convincing. "Is it not?" Charlotte asked, her voice steady despite the ache building steadily in her chest. "I have spent 3 years in this house, Alexander, doing everything in my power to be a good wife to you, to be useful, to be patient, even when you gave me little reason to hope for anything more than patience in return. I do not say this to accuse you. I understand our marriage was never built on affection, but I would ask that you at least extend me the courtesy of honesty, rather than allowing me to learn the truth of your heart from village gossip and careful silences at dinner." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond her shoulder, as though searching for words that did not come easily to a man so unaccustomed to examining his own feelings aloud. "I do not know what I feel anymore," he said finally. "Isabel represents a life I once imagined for myself, before duty rearranged everything. Seeing her again has stirred things I thought I had long since put away." "And what of this life?" Charlotte asked softly, gesturing to encompass the house, the estate, the marriage they had built together in careful, quiet increments over 3 years. "What of the tenants who trust me, the servants who have become my friends, the small kindnesses we have managed to build between us, however imperfect? Does none of that count for anything in the accounting of your heart?" Alexander did not answer immediately, and his silence, more than any cruel word he might have spoken, told Charlotte everything she needed to know. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly, and moved toward the door. "I will not ask you to choose between us tonight," she said, pausing with her hand on the doorknob. "That would not be fair to either of us, given how little courtship or genuine choice existed in the beginning of our own marriage. But I would ask you to be mindful, Alexander, of the position you place me in when you allow whispers and speculation to grow unchecked in the village, while offering me nothing beyond silence in return." She left the study without waiting for his response, walking steadily through the quiet halls of Bramwell until she reached her own chamber, where she finally allowed the tears she had held back all evening to fall freely, silently, into the darkness. The following weeks brought no dramatic resolution, only a continuation of the careful, uneasy balance that had defined their marriage from its very beginning. Alexander did not stop seeing Isabel Grant entirely, though he became more discreet about it, no longer allowing letters to arrive so openly at the breakfast table, no longer riding into Ashcombe with quite the same eager frequency. Charlotte, for her part, continued her work at Bramwell with unwavering dedication, though something had shifted within her after that conversation in the study, a quiet acceptance that she had not fully possessed before. She began to understand that hope, if left unexamined for too long, could become its own kind of burden, a weight carried not because it served any real purpose, but simply because releasing it felt like admitting defeat. And so, slowly and deliberately, Charlotte began the difficult work of redirecting her hope away from her husband's heart and toward the life she had built independently within Bramwell's walls. The schoolhouse now under construction, the tenant families who greeted her with genuine warmth, the friendships she had cultivated with Mrs. Dorsey and Nora, and the small circle of villagers who had come to know her not as the Duke's overlooked wife, but as a woman of substance and kindness in her own right. It was during this period of quiet reckoning that Charlotte first began to notice the tiredness that would, in time, become far more significant than she initially realized. At first, she dismissed it as the natural exhaustion of a woman who had taken on too many responsibilities, who rose early and retired late, who carried the weight of an entire estate's daily operations, alongside the quiet emotional labor of a marriage that offered her little in return. She told herself, as she pressed a hand against her chest during a sudden bout of breathlessness while climbing the stairs one evening, that rest would resolve whatever minor ailment had begun to trouble her. She did not yet know that this small, easily dismissed weariness was the first quiet signal of something far more serious. A shadow beginning to gather at the edges of her life, patient and unhurried, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored or explained away by simple exhaustion. For now she pressed forward as she always had, tending to the needs of others before her own, carrying her private sorrows with the same quiet dignity she had shown since the very first night she arrived at Bramwell Hall in the pouring rain, a stranger in a house that had not yet learned to call her home. Summer deepened around the estate, the schoolhouse walls rising steadily under the careful supervision of the workers Charlotte had hired, the tenant children growing more excited with each passing week at the thought of lessons and books of their own. Charlotte found genuine joy in these small victories, even as the larger sorrow of her marriage continued to settle quietly into the background of her days, neither fully resolved nor entirely abandoned, simply carried, the way one carries any burden too heavy to set down but too familiar to complain of any longer. One warm evening in late July, Charlotte walked the half-finished schoolhouse alone, running her fingers along the fresh stone walls, imagining the sound of children's voices that would soon fill the space. She thought of her own childhood, the small country house where she had grown up with Margaret, their mother's gentle insistence that both daughters learn to read and write and manage accounts, skills she had once thought unremarkable but now understood to be a quiet gift that had shaped the woman she had become. She wanted the same gift for the children of Bramwell, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, and standing there among the unfinished walls, she felt, for the first time in many months, a fullness of purpose that had nothing to do with her marriage at all. It was there that Mrs. Dorsey found her, having walked out from the hall to deliver a message about the following week's linen delivery. "You look at peace here, your grace," the housekeeper observed, "in a way I confess I do not often see in the great house." "Perhaps that is because this place asks nothing of me except what I am glad to give," Charlotte replied, smiling faintly. "There is a certain freedom in that, Mrs. Dorsey, that I have not always found within Bramwell's own walls." Mrs. Dorsey said nothing further, but the look she gave Charlotte carried a depth of understanding that required no words, the quiet solidarity of two women who had come to trust one another completely over the difficult, steady work of the preceding years. The cough began quietly, so quietly that Charlotte herself barely noticed it at first. It arrived in the early hours of autumn, a small dry catch in her throat that she attributed to the changing season, to the dust stirred up by the final construction work on the schoolhouse, to nothing more significant than the ordinary discomforts that came and went with the turning of the year. She continued her days as she always had, rising before dawn, walking the gardens, reviewing the household accounts with the same careful attention she had shown for years. If anyone had asked her, in those early weeks, whether anything was wrong, she would have answered honestly that she felt no different than usual, save for a persistent tiredness she attributed to the long hours spent overseeing the final preparations for the schoolhouse's opening. It was Nora who first noticed something amiss, her sharp eyes catching the way Charlotte pressed a handkerchief to her mouth one morning while helping arrange flowers for the breakfast table, the way a faint tremor passed through her shoulders as she suppressed a cough that seemed to catch deeper in her chest than an ordinary autumn chill would explain. "Your Grace, are you unwell?" Nora asked, setting down the vase she had been arranging. "It is nothing, Nora, only a small cough. The autumn air always affects me this way," Charlotte replied, folding the handkerchief quickly and tucking it into her sleeve before the younger woman could examine it too closely. But the cough did not fade with the passing weeks, as autumn deepened into winter. If anything, it grew more persistent, more prone to catching her unexpectedly during quiet moments. While reading in the evening, while walking the garden paths she still insisted on visiting each morning despite the growing chill, while sitting through the long, mostly silent dinners with Alexander that had become the unchanging rhythm of their marriage. Charlotte, ever practical and ever reluctant to draw attention to her own needs, began developing small strategies to conceal the worsening symptom from those around her. She kept lozenges in her pocket, purchased quietly from the apothecary in Ashcombe under the pretense of a minor throat irritation. She timed her coughing fits, when she could not suppress them entirely, to moments when she was alone in her chamber or walking the gardens without company. She wore darker colors that better hid any paleness that might have crept into her complexion, and she took to retiring earlier in the evening, citing simple fatigue rather than admit to the growing weakness she felt settling into her limbs. Mrs. Dorsey was the next to notice, her years of experience managing a large household giving her a keen eye for the small signs that something was amiss among those in her care. She observed the way Charlotte's appetite had diminished over the autumn months, the way she sometimes paused on the staircase to catch her breath in a manner that had not been typical of her before, the faint shadows that had begun to gather beneath her eyes, despite her best efforts to conceal them with careful grooming and an unfailingly composed expression. "Your Grace, I do not mean to overstep," Mrs. Dorsey said one afternoon, finding Charlotte resting in the small parlor she favored for her quiet hours of correspondence. "But I have noticed you have not been quite yourself these past weeks. Perhaps it would be wise to send for Dr. Foley, just to ease my worried mind if nothing else." Charlotte offered the older woman a reassuring smile, though it did not fully reach her eyes. "You worry too much, Mrs. Dorsey. I assure you, I am simply tired from the schoolhouse preparations and the usual demands of the winter season. There is no need to trouble Dr. Foley over such a small matter." But the housekeeper's concern lingered long after the conversation ended, and she began quietly instructing the kitchen staff to prepare more nourishing meals for the Duchess, to ensure warm broths and restorative teas found their way to Charlotte's table even when she claimed no particular appetite for them. It was a small, unspoken act of care that Charlotte noticed and appreciated deeply, though she said little about it beyond a gentle word of thanks whenever Mrs. Dorsey personally delivered a tray to her chamber. Alexander, absorbed as ever in the management of the estate and the increasingly complicated tangle of his feelings toward Isabel Grant, noticed nothing at all. He continued to sit across from Charlotte at dinner each evening, his attention divided between his correspondence and the occasional distracted comment about the weather or the estate's affairs, entirely unaware of the effort his wife expended each night simply to appear well enough to sit through the meal without drawing his notice. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when Charlotte considered telling him directly about the cough, about the tiredness that had begun to feel less like ordinary fatigue and more like something settling permanently into her bones. But each time the thought arose, she found herself hesitating, held back by a quiet, painful certainty that had grown within her over the years of their marriage. The certainty that even if she spoke, even if she found the courage to admit that something felt genuinely wrong within her, Alexander's attention would remain elsewhere, fixed on matters and people that mattered more to him than his own quiet, overlooked wife. It was easier, she told herself, to carry this burden alone, the way she had carried so many other burdens throughout her marriage. The loneliness, the whispers of Isabel Grant, the years of careful patience that had yielded so little in return. She had grown accustomed to solitude in her suffering, and though the loneliness of it ached in ways she rarely allowed herself to fully examine, it had also, in its own strange way, become familiar, almost comfortable, the way an old wound sometimes aches less than the fear of a new one. As winter deepened, the cough began to be accompanied by other symptoms that Charlotte found increasingly difficult to conceal, even from herself. She noticed a persistent tightness in her chest that made climbing the stairs to her chamber feel like a small expedition, rather than the simple, unthinking act it had once been. She noticed that her hands, when she examined them closely in the candlelight, seemed thinner than they had been the previous year, the bones more visible beneath skin that had lost some of its former warmth and color. She began, quietly and without telling anyone, to take longer rests during the day, retreating to the small parlor with its comfortable chair by the window, where she could watch the winter gardens without the physical exertion that walking them now required. She told the household staff that she preferred to conserve her energy for the evening meal and any social obligations that arose, a reasonable enough explanation that no one thought to question too deeply, though Mrs. Dorsey's worried glances grew more frequent with each passing week. Charlotte's sister Margaret wrote again in late November, gently pressing once more for a visit before the winter roads became too difficult to travel. Charlotte drafted several replies before settling on one that offered a vague promise of a spring visit instead, unwilling to admit, even to herself in writing, that the growing weakness in her body made a long carriage journey feel increasingly like an impossible undertaking. She sealed the letter with a heavy heart, aware that she was quietly closing a door she might have once walked through gladly, though she could not yet bring herself to examine too closely why the thought of travel now filled her with such quiet dread. She continued, even so, to find small moments of genuine happiness amid the growing physical strain. The schoolhouse children had taken to leaving pressed flowers and small drawings at the kitchen door for the Duchess, gifts of gratitude that Nora collected each morning and delivered to Charlotte's chamber, where she kept them carefully arranged on her writing desk, a small garden of gratitude that brought her more comfort than she could easily express. She found herself, during these quiet winter weeks, reflecting often on the strange shape her life had taken, a marriage that had given her so little of the warmth she once hoped for, and yet a community that had given her, in its place, a different kind of love entirely, one built through years of patient, unglamorous care rather than grand romantic gestures. The opening of the schoolhouse, an event Charlotte had anticipated with genuine joy for many months, finally arrived in the first week of December, bringing with it a bittersweet mixture of pride and physical struggle that Charlotte fought hard to conceal from the gathered tenant families and village dignitaries who had come to celebrate the occasion. She stood at the entrance of the small stone building, greeting each family personally, her smile warm and genuine despite the effort it cost her simply to remain standing through the lengthy ceremony. "You have given our children a gift beyond measure, Your Grace," one of the tenant mothers said, clasping Charlotte's hands warmly. "We shall never forget your kindness." Charlotte accepted the gratitude with genuine humility, though a fresh wave of tightness gripped her chest as she spoke, forcing her to pause briefly before responding. "It is the children who give me the greatest gift," she managed, "simply by allowing me to be part of their future." Alexander attended the ceremony as well, standing at a respectful distance as the Duke was expected to do, offering brief, formal remarks about the importance of education and the pride he took in Bramwell's contribution to the local community. He said nothing of his wife's tireless work in making the schoolhouse a reality, though several of the assembled tenants and villagers made a point of praising Charlotte's dedication directly to her face, their words carrying an unspoken acknowledgement that everyone in the community understood exactly who deserved credit for the achievement, even if the Duke himself seemed reluctant to voice it. Charlotte noticed, standing beside her husband as the ceremony concluded, that he offered her nothing beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement when the crowd's praise turned toward her. No private word of pride, no small gesture of genuine warmth that might have meant more to her than all the public praise combined. It was, she thought with a quiet, weary sadness, entirely consistent with the pattern of their marriage, and she found she had grown too tired, in more ways than one, to feel the sharp sting of disappointment she might once have experienced at such a moment. That evening, after the guests had departed and the household had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Charlotte found herself overcome by a coughing fit more severe than any she had yet experienced, one that left her breathless and trembling, gripping the edge of her writing desk for support as she struggled to steady herself. When the fit finally passed, she looked down and found, with a cold jolt of fear that settled deep into her stomach, a small but unmistakable trace of blood on the handkerchief she had pressed to her lips. She sat very still for a long moment, staring at the delicate white fabric now marked with a thin, dark red line, understanding with sudden and undeniable clarity that whatever had been troubling her these past months was not simple exhaustion, not an ordinary autumn chill that would fade with rest and warm broths. It was something far more serious, something that could no longer be dismissed or concealed through careful strategies and quiet endurance alone. She folded the handkerchief carefully and tucked it into the bottom drawer of her writing desk, beneath the journal she had kept faithfully since her first days at Bramwell Hall, as though hiding the physical evidence might somehow delay the reckoning she now understood was approaching, however much she might wish to postpone it. She sat by her window long into the night, watching the winter stars scattered across the dark sky, and allowed herself, for the first time in many months, to feel the full weight of fear that she had been so carefully holding at bay. Tomorrow, she decided finally, as exhaustion began to overtake the fear, she would send quietly for Dr. Foley, without informing Alexander or the wider household, and she would learn, once and for all, exactly what shadow had begun to gather so persistently at the edges of her life. Dr. Foley arrived at Bramwell Hall on a gray morning in mid-December, summoned quietly by Charlotte through a message carried by Nora, with strict instructions that the visit should draw as little attention as possible from the rest of the household. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, well known throughout Ashcombe for his careful, thorough approach to medicine, and Charlotte had chosen him specifically for the discretion she knew he would show, having attended to several delicate matters for other families in the region over the years. She received him in the small parlor she favored, the same room where she had spent so many quiet afternoons resting in recent weeks, and explained her symptoms with the same careful, methodical precision she brought to every task at Bramwell: the persistent cough that had begun in autumn, the growing tightness in her chest, the exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed able to fully resolve, and finally, with visible reluctance, the handkerchief she retrieved from her writing desk, still marked with the thin, dark evidence of what she had discovered 2 nights before. Dr. Foley examined her thoroughly, his expression growing steadily more grave as he listened to her breathing through his instrument. as he pressed gentle fingers against her wrist to measure her pulse, as he asked careful questions about her appetite and sleep and the specific nature of her tiredness. When he finally set aside his instruments and settled into the chair across from her, Charlotte recognized in his expression the particular gentleness of a man preparing to deliver news he wished he did not have to give. "Your Grace," he began carefully, "I must be honest with you, as I believe you would prefer honesty to comfortable uncertainty." "I would," Charlotte confirmed, folding her hands in her lap and steadying herself for whatever words would follow. "Based on what you have described and what I have observed in my examination, I believe you are suffering from a condition of the lungs, a wasting illness that has, I fear, progressed further than I would wish, given how quietly and patiently you have endured its symptoms without seeking help sooner." He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. "It is not a condition I can promise to cure, Your Grace. With rest, proper nourishment, and careful management, we may be able to slow its progression and grant you a measure of comfort and additional time. But I would be doing you a disservice if I allowed you to believe recovery was a certainty." The words settled over Charlotte with a strange, quiet finality, less shocking than she might have expected, as though some part of her had already begun to suspect and prepare for exactly this diagnosis in the weeks since she first noticed the blood on her handkerchief. She sat very still for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what she had just been told, before finally speaking. "How much time, Dr. Foley, if you were to make your best estimation?" He hesitated, clearly reluctant to offer false precision to a question that medicine could not answer with complete certainty. "It is difficult to say with confidence, Your Grace. Such conditions vary greatly from one patient to another. Some individuals endure for many years with proper care. Others, particularly when the illness has progressed as far as I believe yours has, may find their time considerably shorter. If I were to offer my honest estimation based on similar cases I have observed, I would suggest perhaps 6 months to a year, though I stress again that this is an estimate, not a certainty." Charlotte nodded slowly, absorbing the number with the same steady composure she brought to every difficult task, though beneath her calm exterior, something within her had begun to quietly, irrevocably shift. "I would ask, Dr. Foley, that you keep this matter entirely confidential, at least for the time being. I have my own reasons for wishing to manage this news carefully, and in my own time." "Your Grace," Dr. Foley said gently, "I would strongly encourage you to inform the Duke of your condition. He deserves to know, and you deserve the support and care that only a husband can properly provide during such a difficult time." Charlotte offered a small, sad smile that carried within it years of quiet understanding about the exact nature of the support she could reasonably expect from her husband. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Foley, but I ask that you respect my wishes in this matter. I will inform the Duke when I judge the time to be right, in my own way." Dr. Foley did not press the matter further, recognizing in Charlotte's steady, determined expression a woman who had made her decision and would not easily be moved from it. He provided her with instructions for managing her symptoms, rest, warm broths and nourishing foods, a tincture to ease the cough and help her sleep, and a promise to return regularly to monitor her condition, before departing Bramwell Hall as quietly as he had arrived, carrying with him the heavy knowledge of a diagnosis that would soon reshape the remaining months of Charlotte's life. Alone once more in her small parlor, Charlotte sat for a long while, watching the gray winter light shift slowly across the garden outside her window. She thought of many things in that quiet hour of her wedding night 3 years before, standing in the rain before a husband who had not offered her his hand, of the schoolhouse she had built, now filled with the laughter of children learning their letters, of Mrs. Dorsey's gruff kindness and Nora's quiet loyalty, of the tenant families who had come to trust and love her in a way her own husband never quite managed. She thought, too, of Isabel Grant's golden hair catching the candlelight at the harvest ball, and of Alexander's face softening in a way it had never softened for her. She had made her peace, or something close to peace, with the reality of her marriage many months before this diagnosis arrived. But now, faced with the sudden and undeniable knowledge of her own mortality, she found herself considering the shape of her remaining time with a clarity she had not previously possessed. She would not, she decided in that quiet hour, spend her remaining months in bitter confrontation, demanding from Alexander an affection he had never shown himself capable of giving freely. She would not waste the precious time that remained to her in anger or in desperate attempts to win a heart that belonged, in whatever complicated way, to someone else. Instead, she resolved to use the time she had left as purposefully and meaningfully as she had used every other season of her difficult marriage, tending to the people and the place she had come to love, ensuring their futures were secure, and finding whatever quiet joy and dignity she could within the boundaries of the life she had been given. Over the following weeks, Charlotte began, with characteristic thoroughness and discretion, to put her affairs in order. She met privately with Mrs. Dorsey, ensuring the housekeeper understood exactly how the household accounts should be managed, which tenant families required particular attention, and how the small charitable fund Charlotte had established for the schoolhouse should continue to operate in the years ahead. "Your Grace, why do you speak of such matters as though you will not be here to oversee them yourself?" Mrs. Dorsey asked one evening, a note of genuine alarm creeping into her usually steady voice as Charlotte explained, in careful detail, the future management of accounts that would ordinarily remain entirely within the Duchess's own purview for many years to come. Charlotte hesitated, weighing the wisdom of confiding in the woman who had become, over the years, one of her closest companions at Bramwell. Finally, she reached across the small table between them and took Mrs. Dorsey's weathered hand in her own. "I have received difficult news from Dr. Foley, Mrs. Dorsey. My health is failing in ways that cannot be reversed, only managed. I do not wish to alarm the household unnecessarily, but I want to ensure that everything we have built together continues, regardless of what the future holds for me personally." Mrs. Dorsey's eyes filled with tears. She quickly tried to blink away, her weathered hand tightening around Charlotte's own with fierce, protective affection. "Your Grace, surely there is something more to be done. Another physician, perhaps from London, someone with greater expertise." "Dr. Foley is skilled and honest, and I trust his judgment," Charlotte said gently. "I do not say this to abandon hope entirely, Mrs. Dorsey, but I believe it is wise to prepare, quietly and thoroughly, for whatever the future may bring. I would ask that you keep this news between us for now. I have my own reasons for managing it carefully." Mrs. Dorsey nodded, though the effort of maintaining her composure was evident in the trembling set of her jaw. From that evening forward, the housekeeper watched over Charlotte with even greater vigilance, quietly adjusting the household's routines to ease the Duchess's burdens wherever possible, without drawing attention to the reasons behind these small accommodations. Nora, too, eventually learned the truth, though not through direct confession but through careful observation, and a gentle, persistent question that Charlotte finally found herself unable to deflect one evening, while the young maid helped her prepare for bed. Like Mrs. Dorsey before her, Nora received the news with quiet devastation, though she honored Charlotte's wish for discretion, becoming, alongside the housekeeper, one of the small circle of trusted confidants who understood the shadow now hanging over Bramwell Hall. Alexander remained entirely unaware, his attention still divided between the demands of the estate and the increasingly complicated, unresolved feelings he carried for Isabel Grant. Charlotte watched him across the dinner table each evening with a new and painful clarity, understanding now that the months remaining to her were finite, precious, and steadily diminishing, while her husband continued to move through his days with no awareness at all of the quiet reckoning taking shape within his own home. She began, in small and careful ways, to observe him more closely during this period, not out of any renewed hope that her illness might somehow inspire the affection 3 years of marriage had failed to produce, but out of a genuine desire to understand, before her time ran out, exactly who this man was that fate had bound her to for the remainder of her days. She noticed the careful discipline with which he managed the estate's finances, ensuring the tenants were never left wanting even as he struggled privately with his own complicated grief. She noticed the rare, unguarded moments when his expression softened while reading a letter from his young cousin, revealing a capacity for genuine warmth that he seemed to reserve carefully for those outside his own marriage. She began to understand, with a clarity born of her own approaching mortality, that Alexander was not a cruel man, only a deeply wounded one, whose capacity for love had been shaped and constrained by circumstances long before Charlotte herself ever entered his life. This understanding did not erase the pain of years spent longing for a warmth he could not give her, but it did allow her, in the quiet months that followed her diagnosis, to release some of the resentment she had carried, replacing it with a more complicated, more compassionate acceptance of the man she had married. She wrote to Margaret as well during this period, finally revealing, in careful and measured words, the truth of her diagnosis, unable to continue concealing something so significant from the sister who had loved her so faithfully since childhood. Margaret's response arrived within the fortnight, the paper stained in places where tears had clearly fallen as she wrote, begging Charlotte to come stay with her family immediately, offering to send her own physician, pleading for any arrangement that might grant her sister more time or greater comfort in her final months. Charlotte answered gently but firmly, explaining that the journey itself would likely do more harm than good given her weakened condition, and that she found, surprisingly, a measure of peace in remaining at Bramwell among the people and the work she had built there. "I do not say this to cause you further grief, dearest Margaret," she wrote, "but I have come to feel that this place, imperfect as my marriage within it has been, has nonetheless become genuinely my home, filled with people who have shown me real kindness. I would rather spend my remaining months here, tending what I have built, than spend them in the discomfort of travel, however much I long to see your face and your children's again." Margaret could not be persuaded to stay away entirely, however, and arranged instead to visit Bramwell herself in the new year, a journey that would require careful planning given the winter roads, but which Charlotte anticipated with a quiet, grateful joy that helped sustain her through the difficult weeks that followed her diagnosis. Dr. Foley returned to Bramwell regularly throughout these months, monitoring Charlotte's condition with careful attention and adjusting his recommendations as needed, though both physician and patient understood, without needing to speak it aloud too often, that his visits were more about comfort and gentle management than any real hope of reversing the course her illness had already taken. He grew, over these repeated visits, into something of a trusted friend as well as a physician, one of the small, growing circle of people who carried the quiet knowledge of Charlotte's condition and worked, each in their own way, to ease the burden of it upon her. As winter deepened around Bramwell Hall, Charlotte began, in the private hours of the evening when the household had settled into sleep, the slow and deliberate work of writing the letter she knew. Even then, she would eventually need to leave behind a letter that would carry, when the time finally came, all the truths she had never found the courage or the opportunity to speak aloud during the quiet, difficult years of her marriage. Winter passed into spring, and spring into summer, and through each changing season Charlotte's health continued its slow, steady decline, though she managed it with such careful discipline that even those closest to her sometimes found themselves believing, for brief and hopeful stretches, that Dr. Foley's grim estimation might prove overly cautious. There were good weeks, when the color returned faintly to her cheeks and her appetite improved enough that Mrs. Dorsey allowed herself small moments of relief. And there were harder weeks, when the coughing fits grew severe enough that Charlotte retreated entirely to her chamber, seen only by Nora and Mrs. Dorsey, who tended to her with a quiet, fierce devotion that asked for nothing in return beyond her continued presence among them. Charlotte had, by early summer, perfected the careful art of concealment that allowed her to maintain the appearance of ordinary health during the hours when Alexander might notice her. She wore gowns in warmer shades that disguised the growing paleness of her complexion. She timed her rest periods carefully around the household schedule, ensuring she appeared at dinner each evening with sufficient energy to sustain a conversation, however brief, before retreating to bed earlier than she once had, citing simple fatigue that Alexander accepted without question or particular curiosity. It was, in many ways, the cruelest irony of her illness that the very skills of quiet endurance and careful concealment she had developed over years of an emotionally distant marriage now served to hide from her husband the far more urgent truth of her failing health. She had grown so practiced at bearing her burdens alone, at presenting a composed and steady face to a man who had rarely thought to look closely enough to notice otherwise, that even this, perhaps the most significant truth of her entire life, passed by him entirely unnoticed. Alexander, for his part, remained largely absorbed in his own complicated struggles during these months. His relationship with Isabel Grant had reached something of an impasse, neither fully abandoned nor openly pursued, existing instead in the uncomfortable space of unresolved feeling that neither party seemed willing or able to fully address. He continued to see her occasionally at social gatherings and church services, continued to receive the occasional letter that he read with visible conflict before setting aside, but he made no move toward any decision that might have clarified, one way or another, the true nature of his feelings or intentions. Margaret's promised visit arrived in the early days of spring, and Charlotte found herself surprised by how much strength she managed to gather for the occasion, greeting her sister at the carriage with something close to her old, vibrant warmth, even as the physical toll of the visit left her exhausted by evening. Margaret stayed for nearly a fortnight, and the two sisters spent long afternoons together in the small parlor, speaking of childhood memories, of Margaret's own growing children, and eventually of the illness that had brought them together under such difficult circumstances. "You must tell him, Charlotte," Margaret urged one afternoon, taking her sister's thin hands in her own. "Whatever has passed between you these past years, he deserves to know, and you deserve to have him beside you now, whatever comfort that might bring." "I have my reasons for waiting," Charlotte said gently, though she could offer her sister little more explanation than she had offered Mrs. Dorsey or Dr. Foley before her. "I promise you, Margaret, that I have not made this choice carelessly. There is a shape to how I wish these final months to unfold, and I ask that you trust me in it, as difficult as I know that trust may be to extend." Margaret did not fully understand her sister's reasoning, but she loved her too deeply to press further against a decision so clearly, carefully considered. She returned home reluctantly at the end of her visit, promising to return again before summer's end, a promise that circumstances would ultimately prevent her from keeping in the way either sister anticipated, though Margaret would return once more, in the autumn, for reasons far more solemn than either of them wished to imagine during that hopeful spring visit. It was during one such gathering, a summer garden party hosted by a mutual acquaintance in Ashcombe, that Alexander found himself drawn into a private conversation with Isabel that would prove, in retrospect, to be a turning point of sorts in his slow, reluctant journey toward genuine self-reflection. "You seem troubled, Alexander," Isabel observed, as they walked together along a quiet garden path, deliberately separated from the main gathering of guests. "More so than usual, if I may say." "I do not know what troubles me exactly," Alexander admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the confession. "Only that something feels unsettled within me, has felt unsettled for some time now, though I cannot name its source with any precision." Isabel studied him with the same careful attention she had always brought to understanding his moods, a skill honed during their youthful courtship many years before. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it is not truly me you are troubled by, Alexander, despite what you and I might have once believed possible between us." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her, fully genuine confusion evident in his expression. "What do you mean?" Isabel offered a small, sad smile, the kind that carries within it a certain painful wisdom earned through hard experience. "I have watched you these past months, Alexander, and I confess, I once allowed myself to hope that whatever remained between us might grow into something more, now that circumstances have changed, and I find myself unmarried once again. But I have come to understand, through careful observation, that your heart is not truly available for such a hope, however much either of us might wish otherwise." "I do not understand," Alexander said, though something in his chest tightened with the beginning of understanding he was not yet ready to fully acknowledge. "Your wife," Isabel said simply. "I have watched the way the village speaks of her, Alexander, the schoolhouse she built, the tenant families she has helped, the quiet dignity with which she has conducted herself despite whatever coldness she has endured in her marriage to you. I have watched you speak of her, on the rare occasions you do, and I have noticed something in your voice that you yourself may not have recognized, a respect, perhaps even an affection, buried beneath years of habit and neglect." Alexander opened his mouth to protest, but found, to his own genuine surprise, that no immediate denial came readily to his lips. "I loved you once deeply," Isabel continued, her voice growing softer, more reflective. "And some part of me, I confess, still carries traces of that old affection. But I do not believe our path forward lies in reclaiming what circumstances took from us so many years ago. I believe, Alexander, that you have built something with your wife that you have not yet allowed yourself to properly see, buried as it is beneath years of grief over what we lost, and the difficult habits of a marriage that began under circumstances neither of you chose freely." The words settled over Alexander with unexpected weight, stirring within him a discomfort he found himself unable to easily dismiss or rationalize away. He said little in response to Isabel's observations that afternoon, but her words followed him home to Bramwell Hall, echoing through his thoughts during the quiet ride back through the summer countryside. That evening, for the first time in longer than he could readily remember, Alexander found himself paying genuine attention to Charlotte across the dinner table, observing her with something closer to real curiosity than the distracted, habitual glances he had grown accustomed to offering her over the years. He noticed, with a small jolt of surprise, that she seemed thinner than he remembered, her wrists more delicate beneath the sleeves of her gown, her complexion carrying a paleness that the warm summer light did little to disguise. "You seem tired this evening," he observed, the comment startling Charlotte enough that she looked up from her plate with visible surprise, unaccustomed as she had become to any direct acknowledgement of her well-being from her husband. "I am well, thank you," she replied, offering the same careful, practiced reassurance she had given so many times before to Mrs. Dorsey and Nora and Dr. Foley, though something in her voice carried a hesitation that had not been present in those other, more familiar deflections. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something uneasy stirring within him that he could not quite name. "You have seemed tired for some time now that I consider it more carefully. Are you certain nothing troubles you?" Charlotte hesitated, torn between the years of careful habit that urged her to reassure him and dismiss his concern, and a small, quiet part of herself that wondered, for the first time in many months, whether this might finally be the moment to speak the truth she had been carrying so carefully alone. But something held her back still, perhaps years of learned caution, perhaps a reluctance to burden him with news she had already resolved to manage on her own terms, in her own time. "The summer heat affects me more than usual this year, I think," she said finally, offering an explanation vague enough to be technically true without revealing the fuller, more difficult reality beneath it. "I am sure it will pass with the cooler autumn weather." Alexander accepted the explanation, though a lingering unease remained with him for the rest of the evening, a small seed of genuine concern that had not existed within him before that day's conversation with Isabel Grant had prompted him to truly look at his wife for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. Over the following weeks, this new, tentative attentiveness continued in small, uncertain increments. Alexander began asking after Charlotte's day with something closer to genuine interest, rather than the empty ritual questions he had offered for years without truly expecting or listening to her answers. He noticed, with growing discomfort, the small signs of struggle he had previously overlooked entirely. The way she sometimes paused on the staircase to catch her breath, the handkerchief she pressed discreetly to her lips during unexpected coughing fits, the increasingly frequent early retreats to her chamber that she attributed to simple tiredness. He did not yet understand the full truth of what troubled his wife, and Charlotte, still bound by her own careful resolve to manage her illness privately and on her own terms, offered him little beyond vague reassurances whenever his growing concern prompted more direct questions. But something had undeniably shifted between them during that summer, a small crack appearing in the careful wall of distance that had defined their marriage since its very first night, though neither of them yet understood how quickly circumstances would soon force that crack to widen into something far more significant. It was in early autumn, nearly a full year after her initial diagnosis, that Charlotte's condition began to decline more rapidly than even Dr. Foley had anticipated. The careful management of symptoms that had sustained her through the spring and summer months began to lose its effectiveness, and the coughing fits grew more frequent and severe, no longer easily concealed even from a husband who had, in recent months, begun paying genuine attention for what felt to Charlotte like the very first time in their marriage. She found herself facing an impossible choice as autumn deepened around Bramwell Hall, to finally speak the truth to Alexander directly, now that his attention had shifted so unexpectedly toward genuine concern for her well-being, or to continue the careful concealment she had maintained for nearly a year, protecting him, in her own quiet way, from a grief she still believed he was not truly prepared to bear. She chose, in the end, a middle path that felt most true to the woman she had always been throughout her difficult marriage. Not open confrontation, not desperate confession, but the same careful, deliberate preparation that had defined her approach to every challenge she had faced at Bramwell Hall. She began writing more frequently in the letter she had started so many months before, adding new thoughts and reflections as her condition worsened, crafting with painstaking care the words she intended to leave behind when the time finally came, words that would carry, at last, the full and unguarded truth of everything she had felt and endured during her years as Alexander Hartwell's overlooked, gentle wife. Nora, watching Charlotte grow visibly frailer with each passing week, took to sitting with her more often in the evenings, reading aloud from novels Charlotte had once enjoyed, or simply sitting quietly beside the bed while Charlotte rested, her presence a wordless comfort that both women had come to rely upon. It was during one such quiet evening that Charlotte finally confided in Nora the full truth of what she planned to do with the letter she had been so carefully composing. "When the time comes, Nora, I will need you to keep it safe, and to give it to the Duke only after I have gone, not before. Do you understand why I ask this of you?" Nora, tears already gathering in her eyes, nodded slowly. "I believe I do, Your Grace, though it grieves me to think of it." "It is not cruelty that guides this decision," Charlotte said softly, "but a belief that some truths land more deeply when there is no longer any chance of an argument, or a defense, or a promise made in the heat of grief that might not be kept once that grief has faded. I want him to sit with my words fully, without the distraction of my presence to soften or complicate them." Nora promised to honor the request, tucking away in her heart the solemn weight of the responsibility she had just accepted, a promise she would carry faithfully through the difficult months that lay ahead. By the time the first frost settled over Bramwell's fields, Charlotte could no longer disguise the severity of her illness, no matter how carefully she managed her appearance or timed her rest around the household's daily rhythms. She had grown thin in ways that even the warmest colors and most carefully chosen gowns could not fully conceal, and the coughing fits that had once been rare and easily hidden now arrived with a frequency and intensity that left her breathless and pale, even in the presence of the household staff she had once so carefully protected from the full truth of her condition. Alexander, whose attention had continued to grow more focused on his wife's well-being since that unexpected summer conversation with Isabel Grant, finally insisted, with a firmness that surprised even himself, on summoning Dr. Foley directly to discuss Charlotte's condition, no longer willing to accept the vague reassurances she had offered him for so many months. "Your Grace," Dr. Foley said carefully, meeting privately with Alexander in his study while Charlotte rested in her chamber, "I had hoped the Duchess would have informed you of her condition long before now. I urged her to do so myself nearly a year ago, when I first delivered my diagnosis." Alexander felt something cold settle deep in his chest at the physician's words, a dawning horror at the realization that whatever illness afflicted his wife was neither new nor sudden, but had been carefully, deliberately concealed from him for the better part of a year. "A year," he repeated slowly. "You are telling me she has known for a year and said nothing." "She asked for my discretion, Your Grace, and I honored her wishes as her physician, though I confess it troubled me greatly to do so. Her condition is a wasting illness of the lungs, one I have managed as best I could through rest and careful nourishment, but one that has, I fear, now progressed beyond what such management can meaningfully slow." "How long," Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "does she have remaining?" Dr. Foley's expression carried the weight of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before, though it never grew easier with repetition. "I would be surprised, Your Grace, if she has more than a few weeks remaining, perhaps a month at most, given how rapidly her condition has declined these past several weeks." Alexander sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the physician's words echoing through a mind suddenly, violently confronted with the full weight of everything he had failed to see, failed to ask, failed to understand about the quiet, gentle woman he had shared his home with for 4 years without ever truly learning who she was. He thought of the wedding night in the rain, when he had left her standing alone at the top of the stone steps. He thought of the countless dinners spent in careful, deliberate silence, his attention fixed on his correspondence rather than the woman across the table who had, he now understood with painful clarity, spent years quietly transforming his estate, caring for his tenants, building a school for children who were not even her own, all while receiving nothing from him beyond distracted indifference. He thought of Isabel Grant's words in the summer garden, and understood now, with devastating finality, exactly what she had been trying to help him see. He rose from his desk and made his way directly to Charlotte's chamber, finding her resting against a bank of pillows, her face pale but composed, a small, sad smile touching her lips as she registered the visible distress etched across his features. "Dr. Foley has told you," she said softly, not a question but a quiet acknowledgement of what she had clearly anticipated for some time. "Why did you not tell me?" Alexander asked, moving to sit beside her bed, his voice carrying a rawness she had rarely heard from him in all their years together. "A year, Charlotte. You have carried this alone for an entire year." Charlotte studied his face for a long moment, searching for the right words to explain a decision that had felt, at the time she made it, like the only reasonable choice available to her. "I did not believe, if I am honest, that you would have known what to do with such news, or that it would have changed the fundamental nature of our marriage in any meaningful way. I did not wish to spend my remaining time in confrontation, or in demanding from you a concern you had not shown yourself capable of offering freely in the years before my diagnosis." The words struck Alexander with the force of a truth he could not argue against, however much he wished, in that painful moment, that he could offer some defense of himself. "I have been a poor husband to you," he said quietly, the admission costing him more than Charlotte had ever heard him express about anything in the whole of their marriage. "I see that now, though I fear I see it far too late to matter." "It matters," Charlotte said gently, reaching for his hand with a tenderness that surprised them both. "It matters that you see it now, even if the timing grieves us both. I would rather have this honesty between us in these final weeks than continue the careful distance we have maintained for so many years." They spoke for a long while that evening, more openly and honestly than they had in the entire span of their marriage, Charlotte sharing memories and reflections she had long kept private, Alexander listening with a genuine attentiveness he had rarely offered her before, finally beginning to understand the full depth and dignity of the woman he had married 4 years earlier as little more than a stranger bound to him by family obligation. Over the weeks that followed, as Charlotte's condition continued its steady, undeniable decline, Alexander remained by her side with a devotion that the household staff observed with a mixture of relief and quiet sorrow, grateful that the Duke had finally awakened to his wife's true worth, even as they understood how little time remained for him to demonstrate that newfound devotion. He cancelled his engagements in Ashcombe entirely, no longer riding out to see Isabel Grant or attending to the social obligations that had once occupied so much of his time and attention. He sat with Charlotte through the long hours of each day, reading to her from books she had once tried unsuccessfully to discuss with him, listening as she spoke of the tenant families and the schoolhouse children she had come to love so deeply, learning, in these final precious weeks, the full measure of the woman he had so carelessly overlooked for years. Charlotte, for her part, found a quiet peace in these final weeks that she had not expected, a peace born not from any illusion that Alexander's newfound attention could erase the years of loneliness that had preceded it, but from the simple, genuine comfort of finally being truly seen by the man she had married, even if that seeing had come only at the very end of her life. She did not waste her remaining time in bitterness or regret, choosing instead to focus on the connections and legacies she had built throughout her years at Bramwell. The tenant families who visited quietly to pay their respects, the schoolhouse children who sent handmade cards and drawings that Nora read aloud to her when her own strength grew too limited to hold the pages herself, and Mrs. Dorsey, who sat with her through many long nights, offering the same steady, loyal presence she had provided since Charlotte's very first difficult weeks at Bramwell Hall. In the final days of her illness, as her strength continued to fade, and even the effort of conversation grew increasingly difficult, Charlotte asked Nora to retrieve the letter she had been writing, slowly and carefully, over the many months since her diagnosis. She reviewed it one final time with what remaining strength she possessed, making small final additions in a hand grown weaker and less steady than the careful script that had begun the letter so many months before sealing it and instructing Nora, with quiet, deliberate clarity, that it should be given to the Duke only after her passing, and not before. "Are you certain, Your Grace?" Nora asked, tears streaming freely down her face as she accepted the sealed letter from Charlotte's trembling hands. "He has shown such genuine care for you these past weeks. Perhaps he deserves to read your words while you are still here to see his response." Charlotte offered a faint, gentle smile, the same quiet wisdom that had guided her through every difficult decision of her marriage evident even in these final, weakened moments. "This letter holds truths I could not bring myself to speak aloud even now, Nora, truths that require the finality of my absence to be fully understood and felt. I trust you to see that he receives it when the time is right." Nora nodded through her tears, tucking the sealed letter carefully into the drawer of Charlotte's writing desk, exactly as instructed, understanding the solemn weight of the responsibility she had just accepted. Charlotte passed away peacefully 3 days later, in the early hours of a cold winter morning, with Alexander holding her hand at her bedside, Mrs. Dorsey and Nora standing quietly nearby. The household she had cared for so devotedly gathered in quiet vigil throughout the final hours of her life. Her passing was gentle, without struggle, as though she had simply, finally allowed herself the rest that 4 years of quiet, tireless devotion had never permitted her to fully claim. Margaret arrived within 2 days of receiving word of her sister's rapid decline, having traveled through difficult winter roads with a determination that would not be deterred by weather or distance. She reached Bramwell only hours after Charlotte had passed, a timing that grieved her deeply, though she found some comfort in Alexander's genuine, evident sorrow, a marked and welcome difference from the distant husband her sister had described in letters over the preceding years. "She spoke of you often in her final weeks," Alexander told Margaret gently, as the two sat together in the quiet parlor where Charlotte had spent so many of her final days. "She loved you very deeply and took great comfort in your visit this past spring." Margaret wept openly, gripping Alexander's hand with a fierce, grateful pressure. "Thank you for being with her at the end, Your Grace. It is more than I dared hope for, given everything she wrote to me over the years." "I failed her for far too long," Alexander admitted quietly. "I can only hope that my presence in these final weeks offered her some small measure of the comfort she deserved so much sooner." The two remained together for the funeral preparations, united in their shared grief and their shared love for a woman whose gentle strength had touched everyone who came to know her truly. Margaret stayed at Bramwell for several weeks following the burial, helping Alexander navigate the difficult early days of mourning, and forming, in the process, a bond of genuine respect with the man her sister had married under such imperfect circumstances so many years before. The household mourned her deeply and genuinely, a grief shared not only by Alexander but by every servant, every tenant family, every child who had learned their letters within the walls of the schoolhouse she had built through her own quiet determination. The village of Ashcombe observed her passing with a solemnity rarely offered to a duchess who had held her title for only 4 short years, a testament to the genuine affection and respect she had earned through years of unshowy, consistent kindness, rather than any grand or dramatic gesture. It was 3 days after her burial, once the immediate rituals of mourning had passed, and the household had begun, slowly and painfully, to settle into the strange new quiet of Bramwell Hall without its gentle duchess, that Nora finally retrieved the sealed letter from Charlotte's writing desk and carried it, with trembling hands, to Alexander's study. "Your Grace," she said softly, "the Duchess asked that you receive this only after her passing. I believe now is the time." Alexander accepted the letter with hands that shook slightly, recognizing immediately Charlotte's careful, familiar handwriting on the outer fold, though the seal itself remained unbroken, waiting patiently for this exact moment that Charlotte had so carefully planned for in the final months of her life. He waited until Nora had quietly withdrawn from the study, closing the door softly behind her, before breaking the seal with trembling fingers and unfolding the pages within, preparing himself, as best he could, for whatever final truths his gentle wife had chosen to leave behind for him to discover only after it was far too late to respond to them in any way that might have mattered to her while she still lived. Alexander sat alone in his study, the winter afternoon light growing dim through the tall windows, and began to read the letter his wife had left behind for him, her careful handwriting steady in the early pages and growing gradually weaker toward the end, a physical record of the months during which she had composed it, adding new thoughts and reflections even as her strength continued to fade. "My dearest Alexander," the letter began, and the simple tenderness of those first words struck him with unexpected force, a warmth he had rarely heard her express so directly during the years of their marriage. "If you are reading this letter, then I have already passed from this life, and I find myself hoping, even now, that you will read these words not with grief alone, but with the same openness you showed me in our final weeks together, when you finally allowed yourself to truly see me after so many years of quiet distance between us. I want you to know, first and most importantly, that I do not write this letter in anger or bitterness, though I confess there were many years of our marriage when such feelings might have justified themselves easily enough. I write instead because there are truths I carried silently for far too long, truths I believe deserve to be spoken plainly now, when the finality of my absence might finally give them the weight and attention they could never quite earn while I remained a quiet, easily overlooked presence within your household. Do you remember our wedding night, Alexander? I remember it with perfect clarity, though I suspect you have long since forgotten the details that remained so vivid in my own memory. I remember standing in the rain at the bottom of the stone steps, waiting for a hand you never offered, and I remember telling myself in the quiet hours that followed that patience alone might eventually earn me a place in your heart. I was young then, and perhaps foolish in my hopefulness, though I do not entirely regret the hope itself, only the years I spent waiting for a change that came, in the end, far too late to grant us the fuller life together that I once quietly imagined might be possible. I want you to know that I found genuine purpose and joy in the years I spent at Bramwell, even during the loneliest stretches of our marriage. The schoolhouse, the tenant families, Mrs. Dorsey's steady friendship, Nora's quiet loyalty, these became, in their own way, a life I was proud of, even when the marriage at its center offered me so little warmth in return. I do not say this to make you feel the full weight of guilt for what our marriage lacked, Alexander, though I understand if guilt is, nonetheless, among the feelings this letter stirs within you. I say it instead because I want you to understand that I did not simply endure my years at Bramwell in quiet suffering. I built something meaningful there, something I hope you will continue to honor and protect in the years that remain to you. I saw Isabel Grant clearly for who she represents in your heart, Alexander, and I want you to know that I never truly held resentment toward her, only toward the circumstances that denied us both the fuller happiness we each might have found with different partners, under different conditions. I hope, whatever you decide regarding your own future happiness, that you will make your choices with the same honesty you finally showed me in our final weeks together, rather than allowing old habits of silence and distance to govern decisions that deserve better than that. There is one final thing I wish to ask of you, Alexander, though I ask it gently, understanding that it is a request you are entirely free to decline if it does not align with your own wishes for the future. I would ask that you continue the work I began at Bramwell, the schoolhouse, the support we have offered our tenant families, the quiet, steady kindness that I tried, in my own imperfect way, to bring to every corner of our estate during my years as your wife. I do not ask this so that you might honor my memory specifically, though I confess there would be some comfort in knowing my efforts continue beyond my own presence. I ask it because I believe, truly and deeply, that this work matters, regardless of who carries it forward, and I would be glad to know that Bramwell continues to be a place of genuine care and kindness for the people who depend upon it. I forgive you, Alexander, for the years of distance and silence that defined so much of our marriage. I do not say this because I believe forgiveness was owed to you without question, but because I have come to understand, especially in these final months, that forgiveness has brought me a peace I would not otherwise have found, and I would rather leave this world with that peace intact than carry any lingering bitterness into whatever comes after this life. Thank you for the final weeks we shared, when you finally allowed yourself to see me clearly. I will carry the memory of your hand in mine, and your genuine attention finally turned toward me after so many years, as one of the most precious gifts of my entire life, however brief that gift arrived before my time came to an end. With whatever love I have managed to build for you across these 4 difficult years, and with genuine hope for whatever peace and happiness you are able to find in the years that remain to you. Charlotte, there was one more passage, near the very end of the letter, that Charlotte had added only in her final days, her handwriting so faint and unsteady that Alexander had to hold the page close to the lamp to read it clearly. I think often, in these final days, of the schoolhouse children, and of the small pressed flowers they leave at the kitchen door as tokens of their gratitude. I have kept every one of them, Alexander, in the drawer beside this very letter. I would ask that you look upon them sometime, when the grief of my passing has softened enough to allow it, and remember that whatever else our marriage lacked, it gave me the chance to build something lasting and good in this world. That is no small gift, and I do not regret the years I spent building it, even the lonely ones. I only wish, with whatever wishes remain to me now, that you might find your own version of that same purpose, whatever shape it takes, in the years that stretch ahead of you. Alexander sat in stunned, grief-stricken silence for a long while after finishing the letter, tears he made no effort to hide falling freely down his face, as the full weight of everything he had failed to give his gentle wife, and everything she had nonetheless offered him despite that failure, settled fully into his heart for the very first time. He read the letter again, and then a third time, memorizing each careful word, each gentle truth Charlotte had crafted with such evident care during the final months of her life. He opened the drawer of Charlotte's writing desk that same evening, and found there, exactly as she had described, a small collection of pressed flowers and children's drawings, each one carefully preserved, some labeled in a child's uneven handwriting with simple words of thanks. He sat with these small treasures for a long while, understanding for the first time the full scope of the quiet world his wife had built entirely on her own, without any help or encouragement from the husband who should have stood beside her in the effort. Margaret remained at Bramwell for several more weeks after the funeral, and in that time she and Alexander spoke often of Charlotte, sharing memories that helped each of them begin, slowly and painfully, the long process of grieving a woman who had meant so much to both of them in such different ways. Before she departed for her own home, Margaret took Alexander's hand and offered him a final, gentle word of counsel. "She forgave you, Your Grace, fully and completely, before she passed. I read it in every letter she sent me these past months. I hope you will find a way, in time, to forgive yourself as well, and to carry her memory forward not as a burden of guilt, but as a source of continued goodness in this world." Alexander thanked her, though he understood it would take considerably longer than a single conversation to fully absorb her counsel. In the weeks that followed, Alexander became a changed man, transformed by grief and by the belated understanding of exactly who his wife had truly been. He visited her grave often, sitting quietly among the winter frost, speaking to her in the private, unguarded way he had never quite managed while she still lived. He ended, definitively and without lingering ambiguity, whatever remained of his complicated feelings toward Isabel Grant, recognizing at last, with painful clarity, that his heart had belonged, all along, to the quiet, steady woman he had so carelessly overlooked for so many years. He honored Charlotte's final request with the same dedication she had shown throughout her years at Bramwell, expanding the schoolhouse she had built, ensuring the tenant families continued to receive the same careful attention and support she had always provided, and establishing a small memorial fund in her name to support the education of children throughout the surrounding villages, a legacy that would carry her quiet, generous spirit forward for many years to come. Mrs. Dorsey and Nora remained at Bramwell Hall, continuing to serve the household with the same loyal devotion they had always shown, though both women noticed, with a mixture of grief and quiet relief, the genuine transformation that had taken hold of the Duke since Charlotte's passing. He spoke more openly with the staff, took a more active interest in the daily lives of the tenant families, and carried himself with a humility and warmth that had rarely been present during the earlier years of his marriage. "She would be glad to see this," Mrs. Dorsey remarked to Nora one evening, watching Alexander through the parlor window as he knelt in the garden, helping a group of schoolhouse children plant a small memorial tree in Charlotte's honor. "Though I confess it grieves me deeply that she is not here to see it herself." "I believe she knew," Nora replied softly, wiping away a fresh tear. "I believe that letter was her way of ensuring this change would happen, even if she could not live to witness it fully herself." Years passed, and Bramwell Hall continued to flourish under Alexander's more attentive stewardship, the schoolhouse growing into a respected institution known throughout the county for its excellence. The tenant families continuing to speak of the gentle Duchess, whose quiet kindness had first established the foundations of care and generosity that Alexander now carried forward in her memory. Alexander himself never remarried, choosing instead to devote the remainder of his years to honoring the legacy of the woman he had come to understand, far too late, as the truest and most steadfast love of his entire life. On quiet evenings, he would often retrieve Charlotte's letter from the drawer where he kept it, safely preserved alongside her journal, which Nora had eventually found and shared with him, revealing in Charlotte's own private words the full depth of the loneliness and quiet strength she had carried throughout their marriage. He read these words often, not out of morbid dwelling on grief, but as a continued source of guidance and inspiration, a reminder of the kind of person he wished to be, and the kind of legacy he wished to leave behind for the tenant families and schoolhouse children who had come to depend upon Bramwell's continued generosity. He had learned, in the end, a lesson that had cost him dearly, arriving only after it was too late to offer Charlotte the fuller happiness she had so quietly, patiently hoped for during the earliest years of their marriage. But he carried that lesson forward with genuine dedication for the remainder of his own life, ensuring that the quiet, gentle strength of his wife's example continued to shape Bramwell Hall long after her own gentle presence had departed from its halls, a legacy of kindness and devotion that neither time nor his own earlier failures could ever fully erase. 10 years after Charlotte's passing, the schoolhouse at Bramwell had grown into something far larger than the small stone building she had first envisioned, expanding to include a library filled with books donated by families throughout the county who had heard the story of the gentle Duchess and wished to contribute to her memory. Alexander, now gray at the temples but carrying himself with a quiet warmth that would have surprised anyone who had known him during the earliest years of his marriage, walked its halls often, greeting the children by name, listening to their lessons, and finding in their laughter a small, persistent echo of the joy Charlotte had always found in their company. A young woman named Grace, who had once been among the very first students to attend Charlotte's schoolhouse as a small tenant child, returned that year as its head teacher, having pursued further education in London through a scholarship funded by the Memorial Trust Alexander had established in his wife's name. She approached him one afternoon in the garden, where he had taken to spending his quieter hours among the flowers Charlotte had once tended herself. "Your Grace," Grace said, "the children have asked whether they might hear the story of the Duchess who built their school. Many of the younger ones never knew her, and I thought it fitting, if you were willing, that you might be the one to tell it." Alexander considered the request for a long moment, memories of Charlotte's quiet strength and unwavering kindness rising softly within him, no longer accompanied by the sharp grief of earlier years, but by a gentle, grateful warmth instead. "I would be honored," he said finally, "to tell them about her." That evening, gathered in the schoolhouse's main room by candlelight, Alexander spoke to the assembled children about a woman who had arrived at Bramwell as a stranger in the pouring rain, who had spent years quietly building a life of purpose and kindness, despite receiving little warmth in return, who had faced her final months with a courage and grace that continued to inspire everyone who had known her. He spoke of her forgiveness, her steady devotion to the people of Bramwell, and the letter she had left behind that had finally taught him, though far too late for her to witness it herself, the true measure of the love and partnership he had so carelessly overlooked for years. The children listened in rapt silence, many of them moved to quiet tears by the story of a duchess whose kindness had shaped their own lives so profoundly, even though most of them had never known her directly. When Alexander finished speaking, Grace stepped forward and placed a small, carefully pressed flower on the table beside him, one she had kept pressed in a book since childhood, given to her by Charlotte herself many years before. "She gave this to me when I was very small," Grace said softly, "and told me that even the smallest kindness could grow into something lasting if given enough care and patience. I believe she was right, Your Grace. Look at everything that has grown from the kindness she planted here." Alexander accepted the small, faded flower with trembling hands, understanding in that quiet moment the full and lasting truth of everything Charlotte had built during her 2 short years at Bramwell Hall, not merely a schoolhouse, or a legacy of charitable works, but a living, continuing example of quiet devotion that had outlasted her own life and would continue. He now understood with deep and abiding certainty, to shape the hearts of Bramwell's people for generations yet to come. He returned that evening to his study, where Charlotte's letter remained carefully preserved alongside her journal, and added a small note of his own to the collection, a brief reflection on the schoolhouse's continued growth and the children who carried her memory forward with such genuine love. It had become, over the years, a quiet ritual of his own devising, a way of continuing the conversation with his wife that circumstances and his own earlier failures had denied them during the years they shared together in life. Outside, the winter stars scattered across the dark sky above Bramwell Hall, the same stars Charlotte had once watched from her own window during the long, lonely nights of her early marriage, and the same stars that continued now to watch over a house and an estate transformed, at last, by the quiet, enduring power of a love that had taken far too long to be fully recognized, but that continued even now, to shape everything it touched with a warmth and generosity that no passage of time could ever fully diminish. Margaret visited Bramwell often in the years that followed, watching with quiet satisfaction as her nieces and nephews from the wider tenant community grew up within the shadow of the schoolhouse her sister had built, many of them going on to apprenticeships and positions in Ashcombe and beyond that would never have been available to them without the foundation of education Charlotte had first provided. On each visit, she and Alexander would walk together to the small memorial garden that had been planted near Charlotte's resting place, tending the flowers that grew there with the same careful devotion Charlotte herself had once brought to every corner of Bramwell's grounds. Isabel Grant, for her part, eventually married a widowed gentleman from a neighboring county, a match built on genuine affection that Alexander learned of with sincere gladness rather than any lingering regret. She wrote to him occasionally in the years that followed, brief and friendly letters that carried no trace of the old complicated feelings that had once tangled between them, replaced instead by a simple, mutual respect for the different paths their lives had ultimately taken. In one such letter, she mentioned that she often thought of the conversation they had shared in the garden that summer afternoon, and that she took quiet pride in having helped, in her own small way, to open his eyes to the truth of what he already possessed. Mrs. Dorsey continued to serve as housekeeper at Bramwell until her own retirement many years later, training a new generation of staff in the same careful, attentive traditions Charlotte had helped establish during her years as Duchess. Nora eventually married the estate's young steward, and the couple remained at Bramwell throughout their lives, raising their own children within sight of the schoolhouse that had shaped so much of their shared history. Nora kept Charlotte's journal safe throughout her life, eventually passing it down to her own daughter, with instructions that it be preserved as a record of a woman whose quiet strength deserved to be remembered by every generation that followed. As the years passed, the story of the Duke who had ignored his gentle wife, only to be transformed by the truth of her farewell letter, became something of a quiet legend throughout the county, told not as a cautionary tale of cruelty, but as a gentler story about the dangers of taking love for granted, and the redemptive power of finally choosing to see clearly, even when that clarity arrives later than anyone would wish. Parents told the story to their children as they walked past the schoolhouse gates, pointing to the small plaque near the entrance that read simply, "In loving memory of Duchess Charlotte Hartwell, whose kindness built this place, and whose example continues to guide it." Alexander Hartwell lived many more years after that evening, continuing to honor his wife's memory through the schoolhouse, the tenant families, and the countless small acts of kindness he had learned, belatedly but genuinely, to offer freely to those around him. He never remarried, finding in the memory and legacy of his gentle wife a companionship that, though bittersweet, brought him a deeper peace than he had ever known during the earlier, more distant years of his life. On the evening before his own passing, many years later, he asked that Charlotte's letter be placed beside him, and that her journal be given afterward to the schoolhouse library, so that her own words in her own voice might continue to speak to the children of Bramwell long after every person who had personally known her had themselves passed from this world. And long after his own passing, the people of Bramwell continued to speak of the Duke and Duchess, whose story had taught an entire community the lasting power of patience, forgiveness, and love recognized, even when that recognition arrived far later than anyone would have wished. The schoolhouse stood for generations, its walls worn smooth by the hands of countless children who passed through its doors, each of them, in some small way, carrying forward the quiet, steady legacy of a gentle duchess who had once been overlooked, but who was, in the end, never truly forgotten.